I'm here on a ferry. We left the peace of the park, chose to get on this ride to go to where all the action is in the big city. Actually reminds me of another ride I took a long time ago. When I was 4 years old, my family went to Disneyland and never been there before. And my dad was so excited to take his son to all these places that he had remembered going as a child. The problem was I was only 4. And by the end of the day, my father was sick of all the boring kiddie rides. And he really wanted to take his son on something a little more exciting. There was just one problem: Mom. Mom was not going to let her little boy go on anything scary, so Dad hatched a plan. And he found a nice cafe and took my mom there and said, "Why don't you stay here and put your feet up? It's been a long day. You rest, and I'll take Mike on a few other little rides, and then we'll come back and get you, and we'll finish the day." And Mom fell for it, and so she was relaxing there, and Dad grabbed my hand and rushed me off to another part of the park that we had not been to before. And as we go walking, he takes me to the classic ride, Space Mountain. And we go there. There's a long line. There was always a long line at Space Mountain, mostly because it kept breaking down. And so we go in there and we start to get in line. And Dad's excited for his son to have this experience. But the closer we get to the loading zone, the more Dad starts to remember just how scary this roller coaster is. And so we start winding through the line, and we can hear the rushing of the ride up front. And he gets down and to try and ease my nerves a little bit. And Mikey, don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds. We get a little bit closer. We start seeing people get on the ride, and it rushes around the corner into the darkness. And he sees I'm getting even more nervous. He says, "Mikey, don't worry. It's not as scary as it looks." Well, then they strap us in, one in front of the other. And I feel this big hand on my shoulder that says, "Mikey, it's okay. If we make it through this, I'll get you whatever you want. I'll buy you a pony. We can do this." And then it turned the corner into the darkness, twisting and turning, the speed, the screaming. And when we finally came to the end of the ride, they let us off, and my dad quickly checked me to make sure I was all okay, and says, "Mikey," and at that point, I'm ready to hear it. Like, I'm thinking he's going to say those words that every son longs to hear from their father. Like, "When you started this journey, you were a boy, but now you're a man." I'm like, "Here it comes." He says, "Mike, whatever you do, don't tell your mother." Well, he didn't have to tell her, because she saw just how white I was with fear, and she knew exactly what had happened. You know, eventually, when we got to that loading zone, I saw a bunch of other people ride that ride. I heard people talking about it, but I had to choose if I was going to get on that ride or not. And the decision I would make to leave the loading zone and get on the ride was going to reveal some things about what I believed. One of those things being, do I trust that my Father loves me and wants me to have this experience? And it was scary. And oftentimes, those things that require trust are scary. But at the end of the ride, I actually developed a love of roller coasters that has stayed with me ever since. Now, it doesn't mean it's not scary, but I developed a love that can only happen through experience, not observation. When God invites us to join Him in His activity, it can be terrifying. Why? Because it's God-sized. Well, what does that mean? It just means that God's going to lead us out of our comfort zone to do things we would never naturally do, things that mean we have to trust Him. We have to trust that He loves us. We have to trust where He leads us. And that will lead us to a crisis of belief. It's a crisis because it shakes us up and it sets us up to make a decision. And that decision to leave the loading zone and get on the ride is going to reveal what we really believe about God. You see, belief is something that is invisible. It's a subjective experience inside of your own mind. But what we do gives outward expression of what we really believe. As James says, "I'll show you my faith by my works." In other words, my faith will be evidenced by the things that I do. All throughout the Bible, we see God inviting people into His activity bringing them to a crisis of belief moment where they have to decide, what will I do? Will I leave the loading zone and actually get on the ride? And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who never do leave that loading zone. I think of the rich young ruler that Jesus invited to follow him and asked him to do some things, to make some decisions in order to follow. And the rich young ruler never does. For him, Jesus was just a teacher. But I also think of someone like Peter, who Jesus asked to follow, and Peter did. Left a lot of things behind, followed Jesus, and throughout Jesus' ministry, Peter faces all sorts of these crises of belief. And every time he does, he's got to decide to step out of that loading zone and continue getting on this ride that Jesus has him on. And he makes some mistakes along the way, but at the end of that experience, Peter's a completely different person than he was before. You see Peter experiencing and observing miracles before, but then eventually you see Peter actually living miracles, performing miracles. He sees the power of God and experiences God in ways that he would have never experienced had he not chosen to follow. So the crisis of belief he faced led him to follow Jesus and experience God in ways he could have never experienced otherwise. God uses these moments in our lives to grow our faith. And I remember when my wife and I felt God calling us to leave our church in Atlanta, Georgia, to move to the west coast of Canada, to Vancouver Island, to plant a church. And we had to decide, are we going to leave the comfort of what we have right here to trust him, get on the ride, and go into what was largely unknown? And one of the big unknowns for us was, where are we going to live when we get there? Well, eventually we moved to Vancouver Island, and we don't have a place to live. We're staying temporarily somewhere. It's a crazy housing market. And so my wife spent hours every day looking at every available place to live, and we couldn't find anything in the area where we felt called to plant a church. She looks and looks, and eventually we know that our household shipment is going to show up, and we need a place to tell them to put it. And so there's nothing. Well, in a moment of discouragement, after about a month has passed of no luck and our household shipment is coming, they keep rerouting it to buy us more time, but eventually they tell us, on February the 2nd, your shipment is coming into town and we need an address of where to drop it off. And so my wife is getting discouraged. She's looked at everything, and in her discouragement, she just shuts the laptop and prays and says, God, we believe that you've called us to this place. And so we're trusting that you're going to provide, because our household shipment is coming in just a couple weeks and we've got nowhere to live. Well, after she's done praying, she just gets this sense that God is telling her, look one more time. And so she opens up her laptop, refreshes the page that she was already on, and she sees that there's a listing for a house that was listed just a few minutes earlier while she was praying. And it's perfect. It's everything that we've been praying for that we hadn't seen in any other place that we had looked. And so she submits our application, but a bunch of other people apply as well. And then it's a waiting game. They are going to get to choose who they give this house to. And I remember when we got that call and they told us that they had chosen us to give us that house. And we asked them, why us? You could have chosen anybody. And we had gone to visit the place and see it. And the property manager just said, you were the first ones in line. You were the first ones to send in your application, but also I just felt like you guys needed to have this house. We asked, that's great. When can we move in? He said, you can get the key on February the 1st and you can move in February the 2nd. So we got the key to our house about 12 hours before the moving truck showed up into town. And we used that place to have dozens and dozens of people over as we sought to reach that community. Well, 3 years later, the property manager pulled the rug out from under our feet, informed us we had 2 months to find somewhere else to live. And again, we faced a crisis of belief. Did we trust that God would provide? And he did. And he did an even more amazing miracle, but that's a story for another time. And so what crisis of belief are you facing right now? You know, our faith grows on the other side of obedience. We all want to see miracles. We all want to experience miracles. We just don't want to be put in situations where miracles are needed and necessary. But that's where our faith grows. And so what crisis of belief does God have out in front of you? Are you ready to leave the loading zone and get on the ride? Because at the end of that experience, you'll find that you have experienced God in ways you never had before. So why would God lead us into something that we would consider a crisis? I mean, why not just make life smooth sailing ahead? Why does God bring us to these places that are hard, are difficult, that make us stop and have to make these big decisions?
Well, that's a great question. A lot of people struggle with that word crisis because we don't think of it as a good thing at all. And why would God bring a bad thing into our life? But as my dad explained originally in Experiencing God, a crisis is a decision. It's a moment where you decide something about God. And you know, the interesting thing is when you have a crisis of belief, when God speaks and then you have a crisis, that reflects several things. For one, it indicates you don't know God as well as you ought to. I'll tell you this, in heaven, no one has a crisis of belief. Because then you see God as he is, and anything he says, you look at God and say, he can do that, easy. But in this life, we don't know God that well. So when God tells us to do something, we start doubting. Well, what if God doesn't provide? What if God doesn't protect me? What if God doesn't guide me? The other thing is, sometimes it reflects the fact that we think perhaps too much of ourselves. When God says, I want you to do this, we start thinking about our strengths and our weaknesses and our abilities. And we think, well, I can't do that because of me. And our focus is too much on us, not enough on him. And so when I have a crisis of belief, that usually is an alarm to me to say, do I even have my perspective right on God and perhaps not too much on me? And you know, I find too, just with a crisis of belief, what it means is God's stretching us. He's taking us, he wants to take us from where we are to where he wants us to be.
Yeah, and sometimes I know for myself, I often think, man, I wish God would just give me the faith I need to make this decision an easy one. And sometimes it's not an easy one.
Yeah.
And what I found is sometimes God asks for our obedience first. And after we obey, then we see the miracle, like on the Red Sea. God tells the Israelites to move forward, and then they see this incredible miracle. And then on the other side, their faith has grown. And the faith that we ask for on this side of the sea, he often gives us on the other side of the sea, on the other side of our obedience. And so to go through that, to come to those crises moments, it's growing us. And so we don't have the view of God we need yet, and he's going to get us there, but it's going to be on the other side of our obedience.
You know, in the Bible, in Hebrews 11, it says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And the reason we have a crisis of belief is sometimes our faith just isn't great enough. And so what God's going to do is he's going to move us to a place where our faith is greater, where we are able to trust him for something bigger than we ever have before. And it's kind of like spiritual growth pains. Growing pains. In real life, when you have growing pains, it means you're growing, you're getting bigger, you're getting stronger. And I think sometimes spiritually, as we're growing and becoming stronger in our faith, those crises of belief are the pain we experience as we go from where we were to where God wants us to be. I remember when I was a seminary president, I would always correspond with people that were considering being students with us. And we had a school in Canada, and now and then we'd have people in the United States looking to come up to Canada to study with us. But there were lots of challenges with that. You couldn't just work in any job if you were an American. You had to leave family. You often were bringing people's grandkids with you. And there was just all kinds of financial questions and uncertainty. And I remember one year there were two different students. Both had 3 children. Both lived in the United States. Both were going to have to say goodbye to their parents and find schools for their kids, find finances. And they both kept asking the same questions. I kept answering them the same way and just saying, listen, I can't make any promises. I just can tell you every student who has trusted God and come, God's always provided. And both of them were, well, how often can we get jobs? Will there be housing? What are the schools like? And so on. I kept trying to say, you're just going to have to trust God that if he calls you, he will provide for you. Ultimately, one of those students came. They packed up and they moved. And the other just couldn't do it. The crisis was too much for them. They said, maybe later. It just doesn't seem like a good time to do what God's saying. The family that came, about every other week, they were coming in my office and telling me another God story. You won't believe what happened with my parents. When we stepped out in faith, God did a work in their life, and now they're walking closer to God than ever because of our obedience. And then out of the blue, we got this check from an aunt that just wanted to support us. And we got there, and the kids love their school, and they've got a special program for my one child who needs extra help. And then this job came, and this opportunity to minister came. And I would listen to the one student excitedly telling me all the things God was doing in their life. And I couldn't help but think, wow, just imagine what the other student is missing out on because he didn't come. And I think we have to just realize in a crisis of belief that as terrifying as it might be sometimes to take that step of faith, we have to always consider, but what will it cost me if I don't take that step? What will I miss out on if I'm too afraid, I become immobilized, and I stay where I am? It's always worse to stay where you are than to go with God.